always said the Black Panther Party that they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am.
Hey everyone, my name is Andre Walton and I'm the Southeast Regional Organizer for OWR, and welcome to The Revolution. My guest today is Mike McCabe. He ran for governor in 2018 and is currently the Executive Director for our Wisconsin Revolution. Thanks for joining me today, Mike. How you holding up with everything that's going on?
I'm hanging in there like everybody else. I'm going a little stir crazy, but I'm doing okay and trying to make the best of a tough situation.
Yeah, same here. But we know everything is pretty, fast changing and fast paced right now, but we'll definitely get into everything that's going on as far as the Supreme Court. So you have an extensive background as a political advocate, being director of Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. You ran for governor, and now you're the OWR director. Can you tell me a little bit about the new direction that OWR is taking?
Well, our Wisconsin Revolution has got to be about revolutionizing politics in our state. You talk to just about anybody, and they'll tell you that they really feel like the system is rigged against them, that elected officials aren't listening to the people. They're taking their cues from wealthy donors and political insiders, and they just feel like they're on the outside looking in, and it frustrates them that they don't feel like they have a voice. They don't feel like their wishes are being acted on and that their voice is even being heard. And so what our Wisconsin Revolution's got to be all about is trying to revolutionize politics to help get regular people in the driver's seat of our government so that they do have authentic representation and they do get their voices heard and they do end up having their wishes reflected in government actions. That's the bottom line. So it's about trying to identify people who have the potential or the capacity to be change transformational leaders and feeding them into whether it's party positions or running for office or whatever role that we all play as citizens. We need to be aiming to revolutionize our politics.
Yeah, most definitely. And I want to touch a little bit about something that you talked about in your book. So in your book, Blue Jeans in High Places, you really dive deep into the political past of Wisconsin. And one of the things I found interesting that I didn't really know before is that Wisconsin was really the breeding ground of progressive policy. Can you kind of talk about how Wisconsin lost its way and got us to the point that we are now?
Well, Wisconsin does have a tradition of being a trailblazer. And time again throughout history, when change came to America, when major change came to this country, it was often Wisconsin that was out in the lead, sort of shining the light and showing the way for the rest of America. And, you go back to the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, and the country was going through an industrial revolution. There was an economic depression in the mid 1890s, and it was Wisconsin where workers' compensation was first created, where unemployment compensation was invented, where the first vocational, technical, and adult education system created right in Wisconsin. The first kindergartens were established in Wisconsin. Public education really has deep roots here. And on issue after issue, it was Wisconsin that was blazing trails. And, some of the earliest child labor laws, Social Security, of course, was cooked up right here in Wisconsin. So whether it's protections for working people or whether it's advances in public education, Wisconsin over and over again was a leader. We were a state of firsts, and we sort of lost our way. We've stopped being that progressive leader that we have a history and a heritage of being. But that doesn't mean that can't be resuscitated, and it surely needs to be revived now that we have so many officials who are sort of backward looking instead of forward looking. And so I think the conditions in this country really cry out for a state like Wisconsin to resume its history of being a progressive leader.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And it's relatively easy to understand from where we came from to the point we are now. We have extreme gerrymandering. We have politicians who work for technically the big money interests in our system. So it's relatively easy to understand why people have lost faith in the system and why people don't vote. Can you talk about the negatives of people being vote shamed about their decision to not to vote or vote third party? And can you talk about how we should really be trying to involve people into our political system rather than trying to shame them into their decisions?
I know that there are some people who try to guilt trip people into voting a certain way, or try to shame them, or try to bully them into holding their nose and choosing what they, what those voters consider the lesser of evils. Doesn't do a bit of good. I think the thing that's really going to boost turnout is when people are given inspiring choices, when they're given something to really get excited about, when they're given choices that make them think, yeah, there's an option there that can actually get us to a better place, and my vote will matter. That's what's going to boost turnout. Just telling people you've got to go out there and vote, and if you don't, you're a bad citizen, and then telling them, and you've got to vote for this candidate or that candidate, even though you might not be excited about them, because, well, you just got to suck it up and do it, because otherwise you're a bad citizen. That is self-defeating, and it actually drives people deeper into despair. And when you look at Wisconsin's history, where when Wisconsin has really made strides, it's because we have been a very ambitious state, a state that has offered a very compelling vision for where America should go. That triggered participation. But there's another thing that I think we have to understand about our history. I mentioned a number of the areas where Wisconsin was first, where Wisconsin blazed trails, but none of that would have been possible without dealing with the scourge of big money in politics in those years, in the distant past. That paved the way when Wisconsin broke ground and banned corporate campaign contributions and corporate election spending, and when Wisconsin outlawed bribery. A lot of people don't remember that Wisconsin became a state in 1848, and yet bribing public officials wasn't outlawed until 1897. So for the first half century of statehood, bribing public officials was perfectly legal. Well, that's why we had a government back then that was working for a wealthy and privileged few, because those folks were bribing our public officials. And then huge corporations like Standard Oil and all these huge conglomerates were pouring their corporate money into our elections. And they owned our elected officials back then. Once that corporate election meddling was outlawed, and once bribery was outlawed and was made a crime in Wisconsin, that enabled our elected officials to start doing those things like workers' compensation and unemployment compensation and establishing kindergartens and vocational, technical, and adult education. They did those things because they were free to act on behalf of the people. And that's what we've got to recreate in our day, because we do have a system where a few have a stranglehold on our government and on our own elected representatives. And so they don't represent us because they're too busy catering to and taking cues from those wealthy interests. So we've got to deal with that. And once voters are offered an opportunity to vote for people who demonstrate independence from those interests and offer an inspiring and ambitious agenda for what America can become, people will flood to the polls. They'll want to vote because they'll feel, hey, my vote's going to matter and my voice is going to be heard. And that's the way you generate greater participation, and that's the way that voter turnout spikes.
Yeah, I definitely agree. We should definitely have more politicians working for the people. And I kind of want to pivot, but also follow up with that, because I do think they correlate. We're in a moment where millions are losing their jobs. People are suffering. People are dying from the COVID crisis. But at the same time, we see that Congress is responding in a way that more directly improves or benefits corporations. And I just read an article that some of the richest CEOs, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, are getting richer in this time of crisis. They're getting richer while almost 40 million people are going to lose their jobs. So can you kind of talk about the response to the COVID crisis by Congress and how money in politics can possibly correlate to how Congress is responding to this crisis?
Well, when you look at the relief bills that have been put forward and passed and then signed into law by the president, they throw some scraps to working people, but it's not much more than scraps. A lot of the aid has actually gone to big business. And even the program that was designed to help small businesses stay on their feet or be able to hold on to their workers, a lot of that money ended up being steered instead to giant corporations. And so the ultra wealthy are doing just fine. In fact, they're able to get richer at a moment of huge economic crisis for our country. But then there are all these people who are losing their jobs. And when they lose their jobs, they also are frequently losing their health insurance and their ability to be able to afford to go to the doctor if they fall ill. And sometimes they're losing homes, and they're these incredibly vulnerable people because of the way the virus, it preys on people depending on where they live and what kind of housing they have, where they work and what kind of jobs they do, what kind of transportation they rely on. That, you know, the virus discriminates based on that too, and then what kind of access to medical care they have. And so here, during this public health emergency, we have millions of Americans who are losing their health insurance. They're losing their ability to be able to afford medical attention. If there's ever been a moment that illustrates vividly how unwise it is to have health insurance tied to employment, this is such a moment. If there's ever been a time when having a system like Medicare for All that guarantees access to health care regardless of what your employment situation is at a given moment, this is that kind of moment. And so on so many fronts, whether it's economic injustice, health insecurity, in the environmental insanity and the effects of the climate crisis, if there's ever a moment that really shines a light on all of this, this is such a moment that we're going through right now. And yet the people who really have elected officials in a stranglehold are not looking at how to help those most vulnerable in our society. They're cleaning up. They're looking to line their own pockets at a moment of national crisis, which is really shameful. Well, all of us have to both shine a light on that behavior, expose it for what it is, but then also fight hard to create political conditions that can reverse that kind of behavior and can get us to a better place where we have a government much more responsive to regular people.
Yeah, most definitely. With that being said, we recently just seen the Supreme Court decision. Can you kind of give your thoughts about the recent decision?
Well, you know, first of all, I've read the state law. And not a lot of people have, but I've actually read the state law, and I don't think there's any way that anybody with common sense, anybody who just looks at the law, reads those words for what they are, would come to the conclusion that the governor and the state health secretary don't have the authority to take emergency action to protect the public during a public health emergency. The state law very clearly gives the governor and health secretary very broad emergency powers to respond in a way that if there's a serious threat to public health and safety, they are given broad authority to take action. The court just ignored the plain meaning, the plain language of that law. And I think they ignored it because their masters, the political masters they answer to, wanted and needed them to ignore the plain language in the law. The other thing that was so striking is that they made this decision while sitting in their own single-family homes and doing a job that they are paid very handsomely to perform, but doing that job in isolation from each other. They didn't sit shoulder to shoulder on the bench and hear our lawyers making arguments before them in the same room. They were isolated. They were physically distanced from each other. because they could be. They had all the technology they needed at their disposal. They could do their jobs from the safety of their own homes. And what was so striking is that they then turned around and said, yeah, meat packers can be ordered back to work. Restaurants can be told that they can open and have people sitting in close proximity to each other. It's so obvious that the court majority has, those justices have never worked in a meat packing plant where they're cutting up meat shoulder to shoulder with other workers. They haven't worked in a barber shop. You can't give haircuts over a Zoom teleconference. That's something where you're right there with your customer. And they sort of felt like, hey, all of that activity is fine, and people should just go back to normal activity. But when they issued that ruling, they were practicing social distancing. They were isolated from each other. They were protected. There's a fundamental hypocrisy about that that's really galling. So not only was the decision offensive from the standpoint that the court, for political reasons, for partisan reasons, simply ignored obvious state law and put Wisconsin in a position of being the only state in the country where you have a court that's declared that government doesn't have emergency power to protect health and safety when there's a serious threat to people's health. But then the way they did it, under the conditions that they did it, isolated from each other, protected from each other, that was sort of doubly offensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a great answer, and it's almost like they understand the severity of the crisis. But one of the things that we definitely touched on is that,
but chose to ignore it.
Yeah, exactly. It's really weird. Maybe they should go and be essential workers. But we've touched on that there's corruption in our system that isn't being addressed. There's climate change that isn't being addressed, and there's obviously injustice in our social system. And I think our Wisconsin revolution, is a very good place to fight back against those injustices. How can people get involved and help out with OWR and help fix the system that we're unfortunately stuck in and living in right now?
Well, people can connect with us, and they can join. They can go to our wisconsinrev.com and join. They can connect up with our regional organizers. You're one of the 4 regional organizers that we have. People can get involved with local chapters. If there's an active local chapter, they can join it. If there's not an active local chapter, they can help start one. And that's what this work is all about. It is about grassroots organizing. It is about just building citizen power, citizen by citizen, getting people to come together and hang together and be willing to act together. And so whether it's keeping up with what we're up to by following us on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, we've now got the YouTube channel. People can follow what we're working with, but then we ask people to take that next step and connect with us, join us, join a local chapter, get involved. And we really want those local chapters to be reflections of what's needed in those local communities. So to me, every local chapter should be different. Every local chapter should be unique, because what change is needed in Milwaukee is different than what might be needed in La Crosse or in Green Bay. What people are talking about and are stirred up about in Madison is very different than what people are stirred up about in Wausau. Now, there's obviously common threads that run through all those communities, but there are also unique local challenges that exist. So we want those Our Wisconsin Revolution chapters to be focused on the things that people are most concerned about in their own backyards, in their own communities, and so that local involvement is critical. And obviously, we want then to be able to knit all that together into a statewide network of people with the strength to help bring about change in politics. How would it find out a collective voice that's paid some attention by those in in power, and we want to challenge those in power, and challenge the fact that they even hold those seats. If they won't listen, then we seek to replace them.
Yeah. Well, that was a great answer. Nice plug on the Southeast region. But is there anything you would like to add to the conversation before we end it?
It's been great talking with you, Andre. And I guess the only thing I would add is that there's an impulse that so many of us have when conditions are really bleak. And political conditions are bleak today, no question about it. And when the odds seem stacked against us, and there's no question, the odds are stacked against regular people, there's this tendency to just want to throw up your hands and say, you know what, I'm out. I'm going to walk away. And this is the exact kind of moment where we have to resist that impulse. It's never been more important for us to not walk away, but rather to jump into the political arena and try to make a difference. And we're going to run into brick wall after brick wall. It is slow and it is frustrating work, but this is exactly the moment when we have to engage we've never engaged before. Because I'll tell you this, those who are in power, those who do have a stranglehold on our elected officials, they are counting on us retreating. They are counting on us giving up. They assume that when we look at those bleak conditions that we'll just say, you know what, there's nothing we can do about it. There's a great deal we can do about it. And our own state's history shows that there have been these moments of great crisis where people banded together and brought about breathtaking change in Wisconsin. And that can be done again, but it only will happen if people resist that impulse to turn around and walk away. We have got to get into the political arena rather than evacuate it.
Exactly. When we organize, we win. That's one of the mottos. So
exactly.
I really appreciate you joining us today and speaking with the people and helping out the YouTube channel grow. Everyone, please subscribe. I'll have the link down below. Please follow us on Twitter at @OurWisconsinRev and join us on Facebook if you haven't yet. And that's really going to help us grow, expand our reach, and just keep on joining and helping us out the best way you can. And again, Mike, I really appreciate you coming on with me and speaking. I'm pretty sure that people will like to hear what you had to say about the Supreme Court decision and every other thing that you had to say. But I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Andre.
Thank you.
We always say the Black Panther Party that they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary.